I'm going to do something I have very rarely done, which is start with a poem by somebody else. I hope that's okay. Once you hear the poem, I think you will not mind. I've been reading a lot of Thomas Hardy lately, as some friends of mine have been doing too, and some people I don't even know, I suppose. But this is a poem I really just happened to notice the other day. It does something that I like poems to do, and which I find is very, very rarely done in poems. It describes a scene with apparently great accuracy and in splendid detail, and then finds some sort of human judgment and emotion within the scene that has been described. Maybe you know the poem already. It's called No Buyers, and it has a subtitle, A Street Scene. It's a poem that fits what I call realism, which I recommend in poetry, to little avail. A load of brushes and baskets and cradles and chairs labors along the street in the rain. With it a man, a woman, a pony with whitey brown hairs. The man foots in front of the horse with a shambling sway at a slower tread than a funeral train, while to a dirge-like tune he chants his wares, swinging a Turk's head brush in a drum major's way when the bandsmen march and play. A yard from the back of the man is the whitey brown pony's nose. He mirrors his master in every item of pace and pose. He stops when the man stops, without being told, and seems to be eased by a pause. Too plainly he's old. Indeed, not strength enough shows to steer the disjointed wagon straight, which wriggles left and right in a rambling line, deflected thus by its own warp and weight, and pushing the pony with it in each incline. The woman walks on the pavement verge parallel to the man. She wears an apron, white and wide in span, and carries a like Turk's head, but more in nursing wise. Now and then she joins in his dirge, but as if her thoughts were on distant things. The rain clams her apron till it clings. So, step by step, they move with their merchandise, and nobody buys. I spoke this morning about a certain kind of obscurity which was in poetry, which is typified for me by a little passage in an early Auden poem which he crossed out in revision, the phrase being, "Hearing our last of Captain Ferguson." And by the time he crossed it out, the last had truly been heard of Captain Ferguson. Well, I'm going to read a poem of mine which has several Captain Fergusons in it. After the talk this morning, one or two people were saying, we all have our Captain Fergusons, or something to that effect. This poem is called Thinking About the Past, and it just occurred to me this really does have a Captain Ferguson in it, because as printed in this book, through an error of mine, one of the lines has been left out. If you have the book with you, it was one or two of you may, or three or four of you. It's a line that comes near the end of the poem and mentions a friend of mine named Benton. Benton is not only dead and gone in real life doesn't seem the right word there, but he's gone from my poem. Hearing our last of my poor friend Benton. Okay, but I'm going to reinstate him if I ever print the poem again. Thinking about the past. Certain moments will never change nor stop being. My mother's face all smiles, all wrinkles soon. The rock wall building built, collapsed then, fallen. Our upright loosening downward slowly out of tune. All fixed into place now, all rhyming with each other. That red-haired girl with wide mouth, Eleanor, forgotten 30 years, her freckled shoulders, hands. The breast of Mary something, freed from a white swimsuit, damp, sandy, warm, or Marjorie's, a small caught bird. Darkness they rise from, darkness they sink back toward. Oh, marvelous early cigarettes, oh, bitter smoke, Benton. And Kenny in wartime whites, crisp, cocky, time a bow bent with his certain failure. Dusks, dawns, waves, the ends of songs. And it occurred to me in trying to decide what poems to read tonight that I would connect this poem that I'm about to take on with the thinking about the past. It too is a somewhat nostalgic recollection of a friend from Miami, Florida, where I grew up, who knew one or two of the people mentioned in the earlier poem. It's in memory of my friend, the bassoonist John Lennox, and the poem is set in Coconut Grove, where John lived during most of his adult life. The things mentioned in the first part of the poem, it's in two parts, the things mentioned in the first part of the poem are, so far as I know, true. And I've read this poem only a few times, I believe, at readings, but there's one little detail in it which I've never explained as far as I can remember. Let me just mention it. The last line of the first part of the poem goes, "Oh, autodidact supreme." He did teach himself many things, but there's a secret joke in this for anyone who knew John Lennox. One of his passions was 1941 Cadillacs, and he had connections with a lot of mechanics and garage people to let him know about any 1941 Cadillacs that got damaged or wrecked. He would go around and try to negotiate to buy them, and he kept piling up parts that he would take from these 41 Cadillacs, and eventually he had an attic full of them in a large apartment building. The owner had no idea that he had several 41 Cadillacs in his attic, and John's idea was to make an ideal 41 Cadillac out of all these parts, and he did, and drove away from Coconut Grove in it to California, and was seen in Florida no more. So autodidact has for me a subterranean joke in it. Part one. One winter, he was the best contrabassoonist south of Washington, D.C., the only one. Lonely in eminence he sat, like some lost island king, high on a second-story porch overlooking the bay, his blue front lawn, his kingdom, and presided over the Shakespearean feuds and passions of the Eve pigeons, who, during the missile crisis, had stocked his boat with booze, charts, and the silver flute he taught himself to play casually one evening, and taught himself to see, sailing thick glasses out blindly over some lily-choked canal, O autodidact supreme. Part two. John, where you are now, can you see? Do the pigeons there bicker like ours? Does the deep bassoon not moan, or the flute sigh ever? No one could think it was you, slumped there on the sofa, despairing, the hideous green sofa. No, you are off somewhere, off with Gauguin and Christian, amid hibiscused aisles, red-mustached, pink-bearded again as in early manhood. It is well. Shark waters never did faze you half so much as the terrible radios and bouboiseries of the neighbors. Here, if you care, the bay is printed with many boats now, thick as trash. That high porch is gone up in the smoke of money, the barbarians. But enough, you are missed. Across the way, someone is practicing sonatas, and the sea air smells again of good gin. Nostalgia and complaint of the grandparents. begins with a little epigraph from one of Laforgue's complaints that sounds something like this in the original. Les morts c'est sur terre, ça n'en sort guère, which seemed to me always to have a sort of jazzy rhythm about it. I tried to take advantage of that faint suggestion in the poem, in the refrain. The grandparents have presumably come back to visit, the dead grandparents have come back to visit their survivors. And they reminisce as follows. Our diaries squatted, toad-like, on dark closet ledges. Forget-me-not and thistle decalcomaned the pages. But where are they now, all the sad squalors of those between wars parlors? Cut flowers, and the sunlight spilt like soda on torporous rugs, the photo albums all outspread. The dead don't get around much anymore. The French that the Laforgue had read, I should have translated it before, I guess. The dead are underground, they hardly go out. There was an hour when daughters practiced arpeggios. Their mothers, awkward and proud, would listen, smoothing their hose. Sundays, 5:30. Do you recall how the sun used to loll lazily just beyond the roof, bloodshot and aloof? We thought it would never set. The dead don't get around much anymore. Eternity resembles one long Sunday afternoon. No traffic passes. The cigar smoke curls in a blue cocoon. Children, have you nothing for our cold sakes? No tea, no little tea cakes? Sometimes now the rains disturb even our remote suburb. There's a dampness underground. The dead don't get around much anymore. Because of Stephen's introduction, I will read a poem that I know he happens to like. It's called Absences. It was written in the Midwest during a bad winter. It contains in it recollections of my childhood in Miami. It's snowing this afternoon, and there are no flowers. There's only this sound of falling, quiet and remote, like the memory of scales descending the white keys of a childhood piano. Outside the window, palms, and the heavy head of the cereus, inclining, soon to let down its white or yellow-white. Now, only these poor snowflowers in a heap, like the memory of a white dress cast down. So much has fallen. And I, who have listened for a step all afternoon, hear it now, but already falling away, already in memory, and the terrible scales descending on the silent piano, the snow, and the absent flowers abounding. A poem now I don't ordinarily read because it requires a little explanation, but since it has to do with dedicating oneself to writing poetry, and I assume there must be several of you here who have done that or are in the process of doing that, it might be, I shouldn't say it might be appropriate because this is a very sad story. It just occurred to me. It is spoken by a dead friend of mine who in college with me dedicated himself to writing poetry, as I to some degree did also. And the speech he has given here is one imagined for him that it contains in reality about 2.5 lines of verse that he did write. They're just blended in with things I make him say, or that I remembered his having said. And it's meant to be a little like an encounter that Dante might have had in hell or purgatory. I originally published this poem with the name Purgatory, but then I realized that was being too nice to my poor dead friend. And the poem is now called Hell. Robert Boardman Vaughan was his name. He speaks as follows. After so many years of pursuing the ideal, I came home. But I had caught sight of it. You see it sometimes in the blue-silver wake of island schooners bound for Anegada, say. And it takes other forms. I saw it flickering once in torches by the railroad tracks in Medellin. When I was very young, I thought that love would come and seize and take me south, and I would see the rose, and that all ambiguities we knew would merge like orchids on a word. Say this, I sought the immortal word. So saying, he went on to join those who preceded him, and there were those that followed. It was the end of day, vast far clouds in the zenith darkening at the end of day. The voices of my aunts sounded through an open window. Bird speech cantankerous in a high tree mingled with the voices of my aunts. I was playing alone, caught up in a sort of dream, with sticks and twigs pretending, playing there alone in the dust. And a lamp came on indoors, printing a frail gold geometry on the dust. Shadows came engulfing the great charmed sycamore. It was the end of day. Shadows came engulfing. Two more poems, one of a kind I haven't written as many of as I would like, a sort of objective historical poem. This is called A Man of 1794, and it's supposed to be easily recognized as being about Robespierre, but I've been surprised sometimes when people ask me who it was. And like a discarded statue propped up in a cart, he is borne along toward the page allotted to him in history. To open his heavy-lidded eyes now would be merely to familiarize himself with the banal and destined route. He is aware of the mockery of the streets, but does not understand it. It hardly occurs to him that what they fear is that he might yet address them and call them back to their inflamed duty. But this he cannot do. The broken jaw prevents speech. Today he will not accuse the accusers. It is perhaps all that saves them. Meanwhile, his head rocks back and forth loosely on his chest with each new jolt and lurch of the endless seeming street. Impossible to resist this idiot shaking. But it is hard, after all, to sympathize with a man formerly so immaculate, who, after a single night of ambiguous confinement, lets go all pride of appearance. Nevertheless, under the soiled jabot, beneath the stained blue coat, are the principles nothing has shaken. Rousseau was right. Of that he is still convinced. Man is naturally good. And in the moment before the blade eases his pain, he thinks perhaps of his dog, or of the woods at Choisy. Some thought, in any case, of a perfectly trivial nature, as though already he were possessed of a sweet, indefinite leisure. And let me finish with a poem called Sadness. It has 7 stanzas that aren't exactly connected, therefore I will, they are associated but not connected. Therefore I will give a number as each stanza is about to begin. One thing I believe needs footnoting. I mentioned someone named Birchfield in stanza 4. If you don't know the paintings of Charles Birchfield of Buffalo, New York, and Ohio, I would recommend that it might be interesting to look at them. He's an American original. And my mention of him in the 4th stanza has to do with a painting or two of his and also some journal entries he made while wandering about the Ohio countryside. 1. Dear ghosts, dear presences, O my dear parents, Why were you so sad on porches, whispering? What great melancholies were loosed among our swings? As before a storm, one hears the leaves whispering and marks each small change in the atmosphere. So was it then to overhear and to fear, too. But all things then were oracle and secret. Remember the night when, lost, returning, we turned back confused and our headlights singled out the fox. Our thoughts went with it then, turning and turning back with the same terror, into the deep thicket, beside the highway, at home in the dark thicket. 3. I say the wood within is the dark wood, or wound no torn shirt can entirely bandage. But the sad hand returns to it in secret repeatedly, encouraging the bandage to speak of that other world we might have borne, the lost world, buried before it could be born. 4. Birchfield describes the pinched white souls of violets frothing the mouth of a derelict old mine just as an evil August night comes down, all umber but for one smudge of dusky carmine. It is the sky of a peculiar sadness, the other side perhaps of some rare gladness. 5. What is it to be happy after all? Think of the first small joys. Think of how our parents would whistle as they packed for the long summers, or, busy about the usual tasks of parents, smile down at us suddenly for some secret reason, or simply smile, not needing any reason. 6. But even in the summers we remember the forest had its eyes, the sea its voices, and there were roads no map would ever master, lost roads and moonless nights and ancient voices. And night crept down with an awful slowness toward the water. And there were lanterns once, doubled in the water. 7. Sadness has its own beauty, of course. Toward dusk, let us say, the river darkens and looks bruised, and we stand looking out at it through rain. It is as if life itself were somehow bruised and tender at this hour, and a few tears commence. Not that they are, but that they feel immense. That's all. Thank you.